She
They're
walked
coming for
into
us
a biker
tonight.
clubhouse
How many?
with
At
a
least
purple
6.
bruise
All right,
wrapped
boys,
around
let's
her
move.
fragile wrist and asked a question no one in that room was prepared to hear. And by the time that Bioth came out, the Iron Wolves would be questioning everything they thought they understood about strength survival and the quiet kind of courage that never makes a sound. The music inside the Iron Wolves clubhouse in Riverton cut off mid-chorus when the old wooden door creaked open. Not because anyone had announced trouble, but because instinct in a room full of hardened men rarely lied. And every head slowly turned toward the entrance where a small, elderly woman stood framed in the afternoon light. Her silver hair was pinned neatly into a loose bun. Her floral dress was modest and pressed, a lavender cardigan draped over narrow shoulders that looked too delicate for the world she had just stepped into. The Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club sat on the industrial edge of Riverton, Colorado, in a converted warehouse flanked by auto salvage yards and a grain elevator that hadn't operated in 20 years. The building itself was unremarkable from the outside, corrugated steel walls streaked with rust. A gravel lot filled with chrome and leather machines lined up like resting predators. A hand-painted sign above the entrance that read Iron Wolves mean MC, members only, though the paint had faded enough that the warning felt more like a suggestion. Inside was another story. The main room stretched wide and open, a concrete floor scarred with boot marks and oil stains, mismatched tables pushed together in loose clusters, and a long wooden bar along the far wall stocked with bottles that had seen better labels. The air carried the permanent scent of engine grease, cigarette smoke, and something fried from the kitchen and back. Posters of vintage motorcycles hung beside framed photographs of club runs dating back decades. A jukebox in the corner played Southern rock at a volume that discouraged small talk and encouraged a silence that men in leather vests understood without explanation. It was a Tuesday afternoon and about a dozen members were scattered through the room in various states of idleness. Some played cards, some nursed beers. A few leaned over a dismantled carburetor, spread across newspaper on the floor, debating a mechanical point with the intensity of surgeons mid-operation. And then the door opened and she appeared. Crank lowered his beer first. Brash set down his cards without finishing his hand. And somewhere in the back, a chair scraped against concrete as someone shifted to get a better look. Because nothing about this scene made sense. The Iron Wolves were not exactly known for hosting garden parties, and the smell of oil leather and stale smoke did not pair naturally with orthopedic shoes and pearly earrings. She stood barely 5'3" in those low-heeled shoes, and the cardigan swallowed most of her frame. Her face was lined with creases that came not from frowning, but from decades of careful expressions held too long. Her eyes were pale blue, steady, and surprisingly alert behind wire-rimmed glasses that sat slightly crooked on her nose. She carried a small, worn leather purse in her right hand clutched against her hip like a shield. Her left arm hung at her side, partially concealed by the cardigan sleeve, but not enough. A medical brace wrapped her wrist, beige fabric pulled tight over swollen skin. And beneath the edge of the brace, a deep discoloration crept outward, dark purple fading into sickly yellow, the kind of bruise that did not come from bumping into a coffee table. Crank noticed it first, then Brash, then every man in the room whose eyes had been trained by years of rough living to spot damage before it was announced. Ma'am, Crank called out carefully, not unkindly, but with the cautious tone of a man who had learned that unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. "You sure you got the right place?" A couple of men gave uncertain chuckles, but they died quickly when the woman stepped fully inside and let the door shut behind her, with a deliberate click that sounded louder than it should have. She did not look confused. She did not look frightened either, which, if anything, unsettled them more. She simply stood there, shoulders straight, chin lifted slightly, as if she had rehearsed this moment and was determined not to waste it. Stone Mercer, president of the Iron Wolves, rose slowly from his chair near the back wall. He was a broad man in his early 50s, with a shaved head, a salt and pepper beard trimmed close, and hands that looked like they had been carved from the same oak as the bar. His leather vest carried more patches than most men in the room had years of membership, and when he moved, the room adjusted around him, the way water adjusts around a boulder in a stream. His heavy boots echoed against the concrete floor as he approached her with the same measured calm he used when diffusing bar fights or confronting men twice his size. Stone had learned long ago that silence made people reveal more than threats ever could. And as he stopped a few feet from her, folding his arms across his chest, He studied not just the bruise, but the way she held herself. Straight spine, chin lifted, eyes tired but steady. "Can we help you?" he asked, his gravelly voice softer than the rest of him suggested. The woman cleared her throat gently. "My name is Eleanor Ashford." She said, her tone polite, almost rehearsed, as if she had practiced this moment in her kitchen mirror before walking out the door. "And I was wondering if I might work here." The question landed like a dropped wrench, clanging through the room in stunned disbelief. Brash actually let out a short bark of laughter before catching Stone's expression and shutting his mouth so fast his teeth clicked. And for several seconds, no one moved, because this was not a plea for money, was not a frightened grandmother asking for directions. It was a job application delivered with quiet dignity in the last place anyone would think to apply. Work, Brash repeated, eyebrows raised so high they nearly disappeared beneath his bandana. Eleanor nodded once precisely, as if conserving the gesture. "I can cook, clean, handle bookkeeping. I was an accountant for 35 years before I retired. I do not need much, just a few hours, something useful." Stone's eyes moved to her arm again. The brace, the bruise creeping past the fabric. He had seen injuries like that before. On soldiers. On wives of men he had thrown out of bars. On people who had learned to hold pain quietly because making noise only made things worse. "What happened there?" he asked, nodding toward her wrist. She hesitated. Only half a second too long, but in a room full of men who measured trust in fractions of silence, it was enough. "I fell," she said. "We're at home." "On what?" The smallest flicker crossed her face. Calculation. Caution. Something practiced. And then she smiled thinly. "I am not as steady as I used to be." The room stayed silent, but every man there recognized the tone. They had heard it from veterans who did not want to admit they were still bleeding, from kids who had been told not to talk, from women who swore everything was fine when nothing was. Stone studied her for a long moment. Not the bruise this time, but her eyes. They were not begging. They were not desperate in the way he had expected. There was something else in them, something harder to name. Resolve, maybe? Or the particular kind of exhaustion that came not from weakness, but from carrying something heavy for too long without help. "You live around here, Eleanor?" he asked. "Cedar Lane," she answered. That caught his attention. Well, Cedar Lane was old money territory on the north side of Riverton. Well-kept lawns behind wrought iron fences, polished SUVs in circular driveways, houses with names instead of numbers. Not exactly the sort of place that sent its residents job hunting in biker bars. "Family?" he asked carefully. "My grandson," she replied. Her fingers tightened around her purses, strapped knuckles whitening for just a moment before relaxing again. "He lives with me." Stone did not miss the shift. Not lives with him, not we share the house. The phrasing placed her as the owner, the original resident, the one whose space had been occupied rather than offered. She had corrected herself before finishing the sentence, and the bruise on her wrist seemed suddenly louder than the hum of the refrigerator in the corner. "And he knows you are here?" Brash asked bluntly from behind Stone's shoulder. Eleanor looked toward the door briefly before answering. "He does not concern himself with how I spend my afternoons." The understatement settled heavily in the air, layered with implications that none of them needed spelled out. And Stone made a decision without announcing it, the way he made most decisions, quietly and completely. "We have got a kitchen," he said finally. "Darla handles most of it, but she will not mind help. You show up 3 days a week. We pay fair cash." A visible exhale escaped Eleanor's lips, relief carefully controlled, but undeniable, like pressure released from a valve that had been holding too long. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I will not be any trouble." Crank shifted uncomfortably near the bar. "You sure about this?" he muttered low enough that Eleanor might not have heard, though the slight stiffening of her shoulders suggested otherwise. Stone did not look away from her. "We do not turn away someone asking to work." Eleanor gave a small nod, gratitude flickering in her eyes before being tucked neatly away like a fragile thing she did not trust to leave exposed. And as she turned to leave, Stone noticed the way she winced when reaching for the door handle, the brace stiff against her wrist, the bruise peeking darker against pale skin, and something cold settled in his chest. Not anger yet, not fully, but recognition. People did not walk into biker clubhouses asking for jobs unless they had run out of safer doors to knock on. And as the door closes behind her, and the low murmur of the room slowly resumed, Stone stood motionless for a long moment watching the empty space where she had stood, and he knew one thing with unsettling certainty. Eleanor Ashford had not come there looking for employment. She had come looking for something else entirely. And whatever it was going to cost more than a paycheck to provide. She arrived the following Monday at exactly 1:45 in the afternoon, 15 minutes early without fail. Her lavender cardigan was neatly buttoned, her gray hair pinned in that same careful bun. Her small leather purse was tucked close to her side, and she carried a canvas tote bag from which the handle of a wooden spoon protruded like a flag planted in foreign territory. Darla Comstock had worked the Iron Wolf's kitchen for 6 years. She was a heavy-set woman in her late 40s with tattooed forearms, a voice that could cut through a running engine, and a cooking philosophy that revolved around quantity over presentation. When Stone told her she was getting help, Darla's expression suggested she would rather swallow a spark plug. She watched Eleanor unpack her tote bag with the skepticism of a woman who believed kitchens were earned, not assigned. Out came a folded apron, spotless and white, a set of wooden utensils wrapped in a dish towel, a handwritten recipe card tucked into a plastic sleeve. Eleanor tied the apron around her waist, surveyed the kitchen with the calm efficiency of someone cataloging a crime scene, and began cleaning the counters before she started cooking. She did not ask where things were. She opened cabinets, noted their contents, and mentally reorganized the layout without moving a single item. Not yet. That would come later. The beef stew she made that first day simmered for 4 hours. She had brought her own bay leaves, dried thyme, and a small jar of paprika that she measured with a teaspoon rather than guessing. She peeled potatoes over a colander with the fluid efficiency of someone who had peeled 10,000 potatoes in her lifetime and could do it blindfolded. She diced carrots into uniform cubes so precise they looked machine-cut. And when she browned the beef in the cast-iron Dutch oven, she found buried under a pile of mismatched lids, the sizzle and aroma that filled the kitchen drew 3 men to the doorway within minutes, each one pretending they had come for something else. The cornbread went into a cast-iron skillet she seasoned fresh with oil, and it produced golden squares with crisp edges in a tender center that crumbled perfectly against a plastic fork. Crank was the first to try it. He stood at the counter, took one bite of the cornbread, closed his eyes, and released a profanity so quiet and reverent it sounded like a prayer. He took another bite, then another. Then he carried the entire skillet to the main room and set it on the table without a word, and within 15 minutes every piece was gone. By the second week, she had reorganized the spice shelf, labeled every container in her tidy handwriting, deep cleaned the oven, and introduced a rotating menu that included pot roast on Mondays, chicken and dumplings on Wednesdays, and apple pie on Fridays that made grown men in leather vests stand in line like school children at a bake sale. Darla resisted at first. She made pointed comments about people who waltzed into other people's kitchens. She left dirty pots in the sink as a test. She turned the oven to the wrong temperature when Eleanor was not looking. Eleanor noticed all of it and said nothing. She simply washed the pots, corrected the temperature, and on the third Wednesday placed a plate of chicken and dumplings in front of Darla with a napkin folded beside it and a quiet smile that carried no triumph, just warmth. Darla ate the entire plate, pushed it away, and said, "You are not terrible." From Darla, this was the equivalent of a standing ovation. But it was not the cooking that sealed Eleanor's place among the Iron Wolves. It was the books. The club's financial records were a disaster. Receipts stuffed into shoeboxes, cash transactions written on napkins, a ledger that had not been updated since the previous treasurer had gone to prison for something unrelated to accounting, though his bookkeeping alone might have warranted charges. Stone knew the mess was a liability. He also knew that none of his men had the patience or the skill to untangle it. When Eleanor offered to take a look one afternoon, Brash had nearly laughed. She asked for a quiet table, a calculator, and 2 hours. She emerged 90 minutes later with every receipt sorted by date, every transaction categorized, every balance reconciled down to the cent, and a handwritten summary that identified 3 duplicate payments, 1 missing deposit, and an insurance premium that had been overpaid for 11 months. Brash stared at the summary for a full minute before looking up at her. "You did this in your head, had a calculator," she replied mildly. Stone reviewed the work that evening. It was flawless, not just accurate, but organized with a precision that revealed decades of professional discipline. Every column aligned, every note cross-referenced. The kind of work that did not come from talent alone, but from 35 years of sitting in the same chair, in the same office, doing the same meticulous work until it became as natural as breathing. He leaned back in his chair and studied the pages spread before him, and for the first time he saw Eleanor Ashford not as a fragile old woman who had wandered into the wrong building, but as someone whose mind was a precision instrument housed in a body that the world had decided to overlook, and that he realized might be exactly what she was counting on. The weeks settled into a rhythm that felt almost domestic. Eleanor arrived at 1:45. She cooked, she cleaned, she balanced whatever financial chaos the club generated between visits. She spoke little, smiled politely, and moved through the clubhouse like a ghost made of lavender and flower dust, present, but never intrusive, useful, but never demanding. And somewhere along the way, without anyone marking the exact moment it happened, the Iron Wolves clubhouse stopped feeling like a clubhouse and started feeling like something closer to a home. Not because the walls changed or the furniture improved or the smell of engine grease faded, but because there was someone in the kitchen who remembered that Brash could not eat shellfish, and that Crank preferred his coffee with 2 sugars and no cream, and that a quiet member named Decker had mentioned once in passing that his mother used to make sweet potato pie. And the following Friday there was one sitting on the counter with his name written on a sticky note in Eleanor's careful hand. The men adjusted around her without realizing it. Crank stopped swearing in the kitchen, or at least reduced his vocabulary to words that could survive a church parking lot. Brash lowered his voice when she was within earshot. Even the prospect members, the youngest and loudest, developed an instinctive awareness of her presence that softened the edges of rooms she entered. One afternoon, a prospect named Harley caught himself. Mid-sentence swallowed a word that would have made his mother flinch and replaced it with something so awkwardly clean that the entire table went silent before Crank burst out laughing so hard he spilled his beer. Eleanor heard it from the kitchen. She smiled to herself but said nothing, because she understood that men did not change their behavior for strangers. They changed it for people they had decided consciously or not to protect. And being protected, even in so small a way as edited profanity, was a luxury she had not experienced in a very long time. They did not know what to make of her, and so they did the only thing that felt right. They accepted her, not as a mascot or a curiosity, but as something the clubhouse had not realized it was missing. A center, a stillness around which the noise could orbit without spinning apart. Stone noticed it most on Fridays when the apple pie came out of the oven and the room fell into a hush that had nothing to do with respect for authority and everything to do with the primal, wordless comfort of being fed by someone who gave a damn whether you were hungry. But Stone watched closer than the others, and what he saw did not match the picture Eleanor had painted. It started with the flinching. The first time was an accident. Crank dropped a wrench in the garage bay adjacent to the kitchen, and the metallic crash echoed through the walls like a gunshot. Eleanor, who had been calmly slicing onions, jerked so violently that the knife slipped and nicked her finger. She stared at the blood for a moment, then wrapped it in a paper towel and returned to slicing without a word. But her hands trembled for the next 10 minutes. Stone saw it from the hallway. He said nothing. The second time was the phone. Every 10 minutes, almost exactly, Eleanor would glance at the small flip phone she kept in her apron pocket. Not to check messages, not to read text, just to confirm it was there the way a soldier checks their sidearm. And twice when it buzzed, her entire body went rigid before she answered with a voice so controlled it barely sounded human. "Yes, I am fine. I will be home by 6. "No, nothing is wrong." She always turned away from the room when she spoke, always kept her voice low, always ended the call with the same phrase. "I will see you soon," said not with warmth, but with the mechanical compliance of someone reading a script. The third time was the bruises. The first week it had been the wrist. By the second week the brace was gone, but yellowing fingerprints bloomed along her forearm like fading storm clouds. And by the third week a faint bruise shadowed the edge of her collarbone, just visible above the neckline of her dress. Each one in a different place. Each one at a different stage of healing. A rotating map of damage that suggested not a single incident, but a pattern. Stone cataloged each one silently. He had spent 20 years reading men, reading fear, reading the difference between someone who had been hurt once and someone who was being hurt regularly. And everything about Eleanor Ashford pointed to the latter. Brash was the first to break the silence. One Thursday afternoon, as Eleanor scrubbed a pan at the sink, Brash leaned against the counter and said quietly, "You do not fall that often by accident." She did not turn around. "I suppose I am clumsier than I look." "You do not look clumsy," he replied, voice flat. The water kept running. The silence stretched like a wire pulled too tight. Finally, she shut the faucet off, dried her hands carefully on a towel, and faced him with a polite smile that did not reach her eyes. "I appreciate the concern," she said softly, "but I assure you I managed just fine." Stone stepped into the kitchen doorway at that moment. He had heard enough from the hallway to confirm what his instincts had been screaming since the first day she walked through the door. He did not raise his voice, did not cross his arms, just stood there solid and still, and asked the question with the same calm he used for everything. "Who is hurting you, Eleanor?" The question hung between them like fragile glass suspended in midair, waiting for gravity or courage to bring it down. For a second, just a second, her composure cracked. Her fingers tightened around the dish towel, her shoulders dipped ever so slightly, and her eyes flickered toward the clubhouse entrance, as if checking whether someone might be standing just outside listening through the walls the way she had clearly been listened to for a long time. "No one," she answered automatically. The word came out polished and rehearsed, a reflex built from months or years of practice. Stone did not move. "You came in here with a broken wrist and asked men you did not know for work. You flinch when doors slam. You check your phone every 10 minutes like you are waiting for permission to exist. That is not clumsiness." The dish towel twisted in her hands. Her jaw tightened, and for a long, terrible moment, the kitchen held nothing but the hum of the refrigerator and the weight of a truth that had been pressing against the walls of Eleanor Ashford's composure for longer than anyone in that room could guess. "My grandson," she whispered finally, so softly it barely carried past the counter. The words settled heavy in the room, sinking into the concrete floor like stones dropped into still water. Crank, who had wandered closer without meaning to, muttered something under his breath that sounded like a prayer wrapped in profanity. Brash turned away slightly, not from discomfort, but to give her space without retreating. And Stone remained exactly where he was, steady and present, because he understood that what Eleanor needed in that moment was not rescue. It was witness. "His name is Gavin." She continued, still not looking at any of them. Her voice had shifted now, dropping the polished surface to reveal something raw and cracked beneath. "He is my daughter's son, Junie." She said the name the way people say words they have carried so long the edges have worn smooth. "My husband Harold and I built a life in this town. 41 years of marriage. He was an engineer at the water treatment plant. Quiet man, the kind who fixed things before they broke because he could not stand the sound of something not working right. And I worked at Carver Langston Manufacturing in Denver, started as a junior bookkeeper in 1969, retired as senior accountant in 2004, 35 years in the same building, same desk, same window that looked out over the parking lot. I watched that parking lot change from Buicks and Cadillacs to Hondas and Toyotas, and I balanced every quarter through every one of those changes without a single audit finding." She said it without pride, just fact, the way a carpenter might mention that a table they built was still level after 30 years. Junie was our only child, bright, stubborn. She got her father's patience and my head for numbers, though she used hers for marketing instead of accounting. She passed 26 years ago. Car accident on the interstate coming home from a conference in Colorado Springs. Black ice. She was 32. Eleanor paused, and the silence that followed was not empty but full-packed tight with the kind of grief that never fully heals, just calcifies into something a person learns to carry. "Gavin was 6 years old," she said. "Just a boy, curly hair and big brown eyes, and a laugh that could fill an entire house. My husband Harold and I, we took him in that same week. Did not even discuss it. He was ours. He had always been ours. We raised him, school plays and baseball games and helping with homework at the kitchen table every night, until he was old enough to pretend he did not need us anymore." She folded the dish towel into a neat square and set it on the counter, with the precise movements of someone using routine to anchor themselves against a rising tide. "Harold passed 3 years ago. Heart failure. Quiet the way he did everything. One morning he was sitting in his chair reading the paper, and by afternoon, he was gone. And after that, everything changed. She looked down at her hands. The left one trembled faintly, and she pressed it flat against the counter to still it. Gavin moved back in. He said it was to help me. Said a woman my age should not be alone in a house that size. And at first it felt like kindness. He handled the bills, drove me to appointments, mowed the lawn. But then he started asking questions about the accounts, about the savings, about the house. Her voice thinned but did not break. He said it would simplify the taxes if I signed the house over to him. Just a formality, he called it. Something about estate planning and avoiding probate. He had paperwork ready, professional looking. I signed it because I trusted him, because he was Junie's boy, because saying no felt like accusing him of something and I could not bring myself to believe it. Stone listened without interrupting. He had learned that confessions, real ones, came in their own time and fell apart if you pushed. After the house, it was the bank accounts. Joint access, he said, for emergencies. Then it was the pension redirect. Then the investment accounts. One piece at a time, like pulling threads from a sweater so slowly you do not notice you are cold until you are already shivering. She touched the edge of her wrist where the brace had been, and then the drinking started. Or maybe it had always been there and I just did not see it until we were living under the same roof. Whiskey mostly. He gets cruel when he drinks. Says I embarrass him, that I am ungrateful, that I owe him for taking care of me. She swallowed hard. The kitchen light hummed overhead. Sometimes he grabs me. When I say the wrong thing, when I take too long at the store, when dinner is not ready when he expects. He says it is my fault for arguing, that I should know better, that I provoke him. She looked up and her eyes were wet, but her voice held firm, as if the tears were betraying a steadiness she refused to abandon. He does not hit me with his fists. That would leave the kind of marks people notice. He grabs, squeezes, twists, pushes me into walls when no one is looking. The kind of damage that hides under long sleeves and polite smiles. The room was completely still. Crank had his arms crossed, jaw clenched, so tight a vein pulsed at his temple. Brash stood with his back against the wall, staring at the floor. Stone had not moved. Has he hit you? Stone asked, though he already knew the answer. A long pause. Then a nod so small it would have been easy to miss if they were not watching for it. Only when I argue, she said quickly, as if clarifying the rules made it reasonable. And I should not argue. It is his house now. Stone felt something cold and controlled settle into his chest. Not reckless rage, not the explosive kind that burned fast and left wreckage. The other kind, the patient kind, the kind that built foundations before it moved walls. But before he could respond, Eleanor straightened. She smoothed the front of her apron, adjusted her glasses, and what she said next landed harder than any confession that had come before it. I need you to understand something, she said, and her higher voice was different now. Clearer, almost clinical. I did not come here because I am helpless. The room shifted, not physically but atmospherically, as if the air pressure had changed and everyone felt it in their chests without understanding why. I was an accountant for 35 years, she continued. I managed portfolios for a manufacturing company in Denver with annual revenues exceeding $40 million. I balanced sheets that would make your club ledger look like a grocery list. I spotted a 3-cent discrepancy in a quarterly audit once and traced it through 4 departments before anyone else noticed it was missing. She paused, letting that settle. When Gavin started moving money, I knew. Not immediately, not the first month, but by the second month I could see it. The withdrawals that did not match any purchase I had made. The signatures on loan documents that looked close to mine but carried a slant I never use. The pension checks redirected to an account I did not recognize. I could see all of it. Every dollar, every lie. Stone's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted. He was recalibrating. Every assumption he had built about the woman standing in front of him was rearranging itself into a new and unsettling pattern. Then why did you not leave? Brash asked. Not accusatory, just confused. Eleanor turned to face him directly. Because leaving requires more than knowing. It requires proof. It requires a safe place to keep that proof. It requires time to plan without being watched. And it requires a reason to walk out of your house 3 days a week without raising suspicion. The words dropped through the room like coins into deep water, each one sinking with deliberate weight. Stone understood first. His head tilted slightly, and for the first time since she had walked through the door 3 weeks ago, something close to respect crossed his face. Not pity, not protectiveness. Respect. "You chose us," he said quietly. Eleanor met his eyes without flinching. "Gavin monitors everything. My phone, my errands, my schedule. He tracks the mileage on my car, checks the odometer every evening when he thinks I do not notice. He checks my purse when I come home, goes through my coat pockets, reads the receipts. He once questioned me for 20 minutes about a charge at the pharmacy because the amount was $4 more than he expected, and he wanted to know what I had bought that was not on his list. She let that detail sit. It was a small thing, $4, but it painted a portrait more vivid than any bruise. But a biker clubhouse is the one place in this town he would never think to check. And even if he did, he would never walk through that door. Men like Gavin are only brave behind closed doors. They only raise their hands against people who cannot hit back. Put them in a room full of men who can, and they shrink to their true size. The silence that followed was not stunned. It was something deeper. It was the silence of men realizing they had underestimated someone so completely that it required a fundamental reassembly of everything they thought they knew about vulnerability and strength. The cooking crank said slowly, "The books, the 3 days a week." Eleanor nodded once. "I needed a reason to leave the house regularly. A job gave me that reason. And I needed people who would not ask too many questions too quickly, but who would notice if I stopped showing up. People who would come looking." Stone ran a hand over his jaw. He looked at Brash. Brash looked back. Neither spoke, but the conversation happened anyway, the way it always did between men who had known each other long enough to read silence like a language. "You have been planning this," Stone said. "Not a question." "Since before I walked through your door," Eleanor confirmed. "I have copies of bank statements hidden in places Gavin would never think to look. I have photographs of bruises taken with a disposable camera I keep in a neighbor's mailbox. I have a timeline of every withdrawal, every forged signature, every lie he has told written in a notebook that I keep inside a flour canister in this kitchen because he will never set foot in here." She reached into the cabinet above the industrial mixer, pulled out a metal flour canister, unscrewed the lid, and removed a small spiral notebook wrapped in a plastic bag. She set it on the counter between them. Brash stared at it. Crank exhaled through his nose. Stone picked it up, opened it, and began reading. The handwriting was small and precise, filling every line from edge to edge with the kind of disciplined notation that did not allow for wasted space or wasted words. Dates in the left margin, dollar amounts in a center column, account numbers and routing codes on the right, names of banks and notaries in a separate section at the bottom of each page. Descriptions of injuries with dates and locations on her body noted with clinical detachment. Left wrist, February 9th, grabbed during argument about grocery bill. Right forearm, February 23rd, pushed against kitchen counter. Collarbone, March 4th, shoved into hallway wall. A meticulous forensic record of her own destruction, compiled with the same professional discipline she had once applied to corporate audits. Every entry dated, every figure verified, every claim supported by a reference to documentation stored elsewhere. Cross-referenced, indexed, devastating. Stone turned page after page. 53 entries spanning 8 months, each one more detailed than the last, each one building a case that no courtroom could easily dismiss. He closed the notebook and looked at Eleanor Ashford. 78 years old, 5'3", lavender cardigan, orthopedic shoes, hands that trembled when they were not busy, and a mind so sharp it could cut through steel without making a sound. "You do not need us to save you," he said. "No," she agreed. "I do not." "Then what do you need?" "Eleanor." Ashford looked at Stone Mercer, president of the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club, and for the first time since she had walked through that door, her expression carried no performance, no rehearsal, no calculated vulnerability designed to earn sympathy without surrendering control. Just the naked, exhausted truth of a woman who had spent 8 months fighting a war in silence and had finally reached the part of the plan that required reinforcements. "I need allies," she said. "I need people who will stand beside me when the time comes. People he cannot intimidate, people the law cannot ignore. And I need a place where I can finish what I started without worrying that he will find it before I am ready." She paused. "I am not weak," she said, and her voice carried the weight of every assumption that had ever been made about her. Every dismissal, every pat on the hand, every well-meaning suggestion that she should just be grateful and quiet and small. "I am just old and alone. And those two things are different." Stone held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded. One single definitive nod that carried more commitment than most men's speeches. "Then you have got your allies," he said. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. Not in relief, but in acknowledgement. The same way a soldier closes their eyes after confirming that backup has arrived and the next phase of the operation can begin. She retrieved the notebook from the counter, sealed it back in the plastic bag, returned it to the flour canister, and screwed the lid on tight. She untied her apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on the hook beside the stove. "I will see you Wednesday," she said, and picked up her purse. Stone walked her to the door. Outside, the late afternoon light stretched long across the gravel lot, painting everything in amber and shadow. The row of motorcycles gleamed under the fading sun. A hawk circled lazily above the grain elevator. And Eleanor Ashford, 78 years old, walked to her sensible sedan, parked at the far edge of the lot with the careful, measured steps of a woman who had learned to ration her courage the way others rationed medicine. At the car door, she turned back. Stone stood in the clubhouse entrance, arms folded, watching. "He will notice," she said quietly, "that I seem different. He always notices." Stone said nothing, just held her gaze. She nodded to herself as if confirming something she already knew and climbed into the car. The engine turned over with a modest purr, and she pulled out of the lot, slowly signaling left, even though there was no other traffic on the road, because Eleanor Ashford was a woman who followed rules even when the world had stopped following them for her. Stone watched the car disappear around the bend. Then he stood there for another full minute, staring at the empty road, feeling the weight of what he now carried. Behind him, Brash appeared in the doorway. "What do you want to do?" he asked. Stone turned and walked back inside. The main room had gone quiet in a way that had nothing to do with volume. Men sat at their tables, beers untouched, cards unplayed, each one processing what they had witnessed at his own speed and in his own way. Crank stood at the bar, turning a coaster over and over between his fingers. A prospect near the jukebox stared at the wall like he was trying to read something written there in invisible ink. "For now," Stone said, his voice carrying just enough to reach every corner without shouting, "we do exactly what she asked. We show up, we pay attention, and we make sure that when she is ready, there is not a single crack in her armor that grandson of hers can crawl through. Nobody talks about this outside these walls. Nobody approaches the grandson. Nobody does anything that spooks her into thinking she made a mistake trusting us. She has a plan, and our job is to make sure that plan holds." Brash nodded slowly. "And if he comes here looking for her," Stone paused at the bar, poured himself a measure of whiskey, and set the bottle down with a deliberate thud. "Then he finds out why she chose us." The evening settled over Riverton in shades of copper and ash. At the clubhouse, men returned to their cards and their beers and their mechanical debates, but the atmosphere had changed in ways none of them could quite articulate. Something had been placed among them, a responsibility they had not asked for but could not put down. And in the back of the kitchen, inside a metal flour canister above the industrial mixer, a small spiral notebook sat wrapped in plastic, holding 53 entries of meticulous, patient, devastating truth. 11 miles north on Cedar Lane, Eleanor Ashford pulled into the driveway of a two-story colonial with white shutters and a manicured lawn. She sat in the car for 30 seconds, composing herself. She checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, adjusted her glasses, smoothed her hair, practiced the expression she would wear through the door. Pleasant, neutral, invisible. Then she saw the front porch light was off, which meant Gavin had turned it off deliberately, which meant he was awake and watching from inside, which meant he had been counting the minutes since she left and had calculated exactly how long the drive should take and had already decided whether she had deviated from the timeline he kept in his head. She gathered her purse, opened the car door, walked up the flagstone path with measured steps, and as she reached for the front door handle, it opened from inside and Gavin Ashford stood in the frame. He was tall, lean in a way that suggested energy burned by restlessness rather than exercise. 32 years old with dark hair cropped short and a face that might have been handsome if not for the permanent tension around his mouth, as if his jaw was always preparing for an argument his tongue had not yet started. He wore a wrinkled polo shirt, expensive jeans, and no shoes. A glass of whiskey rested in his left hand half empty, and his eyes tracked Eleanor the way a cat tracks movement, patient and predatory, and entirely without warmth. "You are late," he said. Eleanor stepped inside. The foyer was dim. The house smelled of stale air and something sharp underneath the chemical sweetness of liquor metabolizing through skin. The hallway table he held a stack of unopened mail that Gavin sorted each morning before she woke, removing anything he did not want her to see. A bank statement, an insurance notice, a letter from the county assessor's office that she had glimpsed once before it disappeared. The house itself was a monument to a life that no longer existed in the way she remembered it. The living room still held Harold's reading chair, but Gavin had moved it to the corner, replaced it in the central position with a leather recliner he had ordered online with her credit card. Family photographs that once lined the hallway had been taken down, not discarded but relocated to the guest bedroom upstairs as if the history of the Ashford family was something to be stored rather than displayed. The kitchen where Eleanor had cooked 10,000 meals over 4 decades now held a mini fridge beneath the counter, stocked with Gavin's whiskey and imported beer, and the spice rack she had organized by alphabet had been shoved to the back of the cabinet to make room for protein powder and energy drinks. It was still her house in every legal sense that mattered, except that it was not, and the distinction between living somewhere and being allowed to exist there was a line so thin most people never saw it until they were standing on the wrong side. "Traffic on Hollister," she said calmly. He did not move from the doorway, forcing her to squeeze past him to enter her own home. A small act of dominance so practiced it had become invisible to both of them, except that tonight for the first time in months Eleanor noticed it. And noticing it made something tighten in her chest that was not fear. It was clarity. She moved past him toward the kitchen, set her purse on the counter, and began pulling ingredients from the refrigerator for dinner. Behind her, she heard the glass clink against the hallway table, heard his footsteps following, heard the particular cadence of his breathing that told her exactly how much whiskey he had consumed and how much patience she had left to spend. "Where were you?" he asked again, standing too close. "Always standing too close." "I told you. I volunteer at the church on Mondays." The lie came easily. It had been the same lie for 3 weeks, and it sat comfortably in her mouth like a stone she had smoothed with her tongue. Gavin did not go to church, did not know anyone at the church, would never check. "You smelled different," he said. Eleanor's hands paused over the cutting board. She did not turn around. "They were cooking for the fundraiser," she said evenly. "I helped in the kitchen." Gavin stood there for another moment. She could feel his eyes on the back of her neck, scanning for inconsistencies the way she scanned ledgers, searching for the thing that did not add up, the detail that would give him permission to escalate from suspicion to accusation, and from accusation to the kind of punishment he had convinced himself she deserved. Then he grunted, took his glass, and walked toward the living room. The television came on, volume too loud as always. A sports commentator's voice filled the house with manufactured enthusiasm that Gavin absorbed the way dry ground absorbs rain passively and endlessly, because a man who had nothing to build spent his evenings watching other men compete. Eleanor exhaled slowly through her nose. She picked up the knife and began slicing an onion with steady, precise strokes. And in the quiet of that kitchen, standing in a house that bore her name on 41 years of memories but no longer on the deed cooking dinner, for a man who had stolen everything she had built, over 78 years of careful, dignified living, Eleanor Ashford allowed herself one small, private, undetectable smile. Because he had not asked about the biker club, had not suspected, had not imagined even for a moment that the woman he dismissed as old and confused and manageable had spent the last 3 weeks laying the foundation for his undoing, and that she knew was his greatest weakness. Not the drinking, not the cruelty, not even the greed. It was the absolute certainty that she was too old to fight back. Upstairs in a bedroom closet behind a stack of winter blankets, a disposable camera sat in a shoebox with 14 photographs of bruises. In a neighbor's mailbox on the next block, a sealed envelope held copies of bank statements and forged signatures. And in a biker clubhouse 11 miles south inside a flour canister, in a kitchen that smelled of cornbread and bay leaves, a spiral notebook held 53 entries of evidence that would one day bring this house, this man, and this silence crashing down. Eleanor Ashford sliced the onion, wiped her eyes, and continued preparing dinner with the patient, methodical calm of a woman who understood better than anyone in that house that the most dangerous weapon in the world is not a fist. It is a ledger. Eleanor did not come on Wednesday. Stone noticed at 2 o'clock when the kitchen stayed dark and the coffee pot sat cold on the counter, and the clubhouse carried the particular emptiness of a room missing the person who had given it warmth without anyone asking her to. He checked his phone. No message, no missed call, nothing. He waited until 3, then called her number. It rang 6 times and went to voicemail. The automated voice recited the number back to him without a name because Eleanor Ashford was the kind of woman who had never recorded a personal greeting, and the absence of her voice on the line felt more alarming than any message could have. He called again at 4. Same result. Brash leaned against the bar with his arms crossed. She has never missed a day. Stone said nothing. He stared at the phone in his hand, turning it over slowly, running through possibilities he did not want to finish. Traffic accident, hospital, or the other thing. The thing that lived in the space between every bruise she had shown them and every bruise she had not. Friday came and went. No Eleanor. The kitchen stayed cold. Darla returned to cooking duty without comment, but the food tasted flat and institutional, and Crank left half his plate untouched, which for a man who treated meals as competitive events was the equivalent of a written protest. By Saturday, Stone made a decision. He sent Crank on a drive past Cedar Lane. Crank took the long way, looping through the neighborhood in his truck rather than on his bike because chrome and leather attracted the kind of attention that Cedar Lane homeowners translated into phone calls to the police. He drove past the Ashford house at 20 miles per hour, windows down, eyes working. The house was a 2-story colonial with white shutters and a lawn that had recently been mowed. The driveway held a dark SUV and Eleanor's beige sedan, both vehicles present, both parked. The curtains on every window were drawn, which on a sunny Saturday afternoon in a neighborhood where people displayed their interiors like showrooms was notable enough to record. No movement, no lights visible through the fabric. The porch light was off. The mailbox at the curb was full envelopes and a newspaper jutting from the slot at angles that suggested several days of accumulation without retrieval. Crank circled the block once more, slower this time, and noticed something else. A security camera mounted above the garage of the house next door, a slightly smaller colonial, with a garden bed full of marigolds and a ceramic bird bath near the front walk. The camera was angled toward the street, but its field of view clearly included a portion of the Ashford driveway and front entrance. He noted the address and drove back to the clubhouse. On Sunday, Stone called Eleanor's number one more time. This time someone answered, but it was not Eleanor, a male voice tight with irritation. Yeah, Stone recognized the tone immediately. The clipped entitlement of a man who answered other people's phones because he considered everything in the house his property, including the person who owned it. I am looking for Eleanor, Stone said evenly. She is not available. When will she be available? A pause, then, who is this? Stone considered his options. He could identify himself. He could provoke. He could play a role. He chose the one that served Eleanor's plan rather than his own instincts. This is the church office. She volunteers on our kitchen committee. We missed her this week and wanted to check in. The silence on the other end lasted 3 seconds too long. Then Gavin Ashford said, she has been under the weather. She will call when she is feeling better. And the line went dead. Stone set the phone down and looked at Brash. Under the weather, Brash repeated. Stone nodded slowly. 5 days, curtains drawn, mailbox full, and a grandson who answers her phone and speaks about her like she is inventory. The room was quiet. Crank sat at the bar, jaw tight, both hands wrapped around a glass he had not drunk from. A prospect near the door shifted his weight from one foot to the other, uncomfortable with a tension he could feel but could not name. And Stone sat perfectly still because stillness was where he did his clearest thinking, and what he was thinking required absolute clarity. She told us she had a plan, he said. She told us she needed allies, not rescuers. So we wait, but we watch. And the moment she walks through that door, we are ready for whatever she brings with her. She came on Tuesday. 6 days after her last visit at exactly 1:45 in the afternoon, the clubhouse door opened, and Eleanor Ashford stepped inside. The light from outside framed her the same way it had the first time she appeared, but the woman in the frame was different now. Not broken, not smaller, but altered in the way that people are altered when violence has stopped being an interruption and has become the architecture of their daily life. She moved slowly, more slowly than usual, with a careful deliberation that suggested pain in places she was trying not to reveal. Her lavender cardigan was buttoned to the collar higher than she normally wore it, and the reason became apparent when she turned her head and the fabric shifted to expose the edge of a bruise that ran from her collarbone to the base of her throat. Her gray hair was pinned in the familiar bun, though looser than normal, as if her hands had not been steady enough for precision. Her glasses sat slightly crooked on her nose, and she did not straighten them. She carried her leather purse in her right hand and a canvas grocery bag in her left, the bag heavy enough to pull her shoulder into a slight droop that she corrected with visible effort as she crossed the threshold. Crank saw her first. He set his beer down without a sound. Brash looked up from the newspaper he had been pretending to read, and Stone, who had been sitting in his usual chair near the back wall, rose to his feet with a slowness that was not casual but controlled the way a man rises when he does not want the room to feel the earthquake building beneath the floor, because he could see it before she reached the light. The left side of her face carried a bruise that started below her eye and spread across her cheekbone in shades of deep purple and green, the kind of discoloration that no amount of concealer could hide and that she had not even attempted to cover. Her left eye was swollen partially shut, the lid puffy and dark, and she walked with a limp that favored her right side, each step measured and cautious, as if her ribs were reminding her with every movement that breathing was a privilege and not a right. The room went silent the way rooms go silent before storms. Not gradually, but all at once, as if someone had pulled a plug and drained every sound from the space. Eleanor walked to the kitchen counter, set the grocery bag down, and looked at Stone with her one fully open eye. The expression on her face was not defeat. It was not despair. It was the cold, exhausted clarity of a woman who had absorbed the worst her enemy could deliver and was still standing. He found out, she said. Her voice was hoarse, as if it had been used for screaming or had not been used at all for several days. He checked the mileage. The numbers did not match the church. He went through my purse and found a receipt from the binding station near the highway, which is not on the route to the church. He waited until I was making dinner and asked me where I had really been going 3 days a week. She paused. The kitchen clock ticked. I told him the truth, she said. Not all of it, but enough. I told him I had been working at a place in town to stay busy. He wanted to know where, I would not say. And that was when he decided that I needed to understand what happens when I keep secrets from him. She touched the edge of her bruised cheek with her fingertips gently, the way a person touches a wound to confirm it is real. 5 days, she continued. He took my phone, took my car keys, locked the deadbolt from outside when he left for work. I could not leave, could not call. He brought groceries twice and left them on the kitchen counter without speaking to me, like feeding an animal. Crank exhaled through his teeth. Brash's knuckles went white around the edge of the bar, and Stone stood absolutely motionless, his expression carved from the same stone that gave him his name, because what was building inside him was not the kind of anger that burned. It was the kind that planned. But Eleanor was not finished. She reached into the canvas grocery bag, and what she pulled out was not food. It was a manila envelope, thick as a fist, sealed with packing tape, and slightly bent at the corners from being compressed beneath canned goods and bread loaves. She set it on the counter between them with the careful precision of a woman placing evidence on a table. I have been copying documents for 8 months, she said. Bank statements, loan applications, title transfers, insurance correspondence. Everything Gavin signed, filed, redirected, or forged. I kept them in different places. Some in the flour canister here, some in a shoebox in my closet, some in my neighbor's mailbox. But over the last 5 days, while he kept me locked in, he had nothing but time. She opened the envelope and spread the contents across the counter. Dozens of pages, photocopies and originals, some crisp and some worn at the folds, organized into sections held together with paper clips and labeled in her precise handwriting. Stone looked at the pages. Then he looked at Eleanor. He locks you in the house for 5 days, he said slowly, and you use that time to organize evidence. Eleanor adjusted her glasses with trembling fingers. I told you. I am not helpless. I am just old. And old means patient. She pulled a chair to the counter, sat down with a wince she tried to hide and failed, and began walking them through the documents with the methodical calm of an accountant delivering a quarterly report. She started with the bank statements. 3 accounts. A savings account at First National that Eleanor and Harold had maintained for 37 years, which at the time of Harold's death held just over $212,000. A retirement account through her former employer's pension plan valued at approximately $140,000, and a checking account that received her monthly Social Security deposit of $1,800. Gavin had gained access to all 3 within 4 months of Harold's death. Joint signatory authority on the checking account, which Eleanor had agreed to for convenience. Power of attorney over the savings account, which Gavin had presented as a necessary step for estate settlement. And beneficiary redirect on the pension, accomplished through a form that carried Eleanor's signature, but which she had never seen, never signed, and which contained a date on which she had been at a medical appointment 30 miles away. She laid each statement side by side, tracing the withdrawals with her fingertip. 15,000 here, 22,000 there, 8,000 on a Tuesday in March, 40,000 on a Friday in June. Each one documented, dated, and cross-referenced with the corresponding entry in her spiral notebook. The total from the accounts alone, she said, tapping the final page, is $341,812. And that is before we count the house. That is what he has taken from me over 2.5 years. The number sat on the counter like a physical object. Crank stared at it. Brash did the math in his head and arrived at the same figure and said nothing because there was nothing to say. But Eleanor was not finished. She pulled a second set of documents from the envelope. These were different. Legal-sized pages with notarized seals and printed headers from title companies and county filing offices. The house, she said, Cedar Lane. Harold and I bought it in 1983 for $67,000. We paid it off in 1998. It was ours free and clear for 25 years. She laid a deed transfer document on the counter. Dated 14 months ago, signed by Eleanor Ashford, transferring full ownership of the property to Gavin Ashford for the stated consideration of $1. I signed this, she acknowledged. He told me it was for tax purposes, that keeping the house in my name created a liability for the estate. I did not have it reviewed by an attorney because he said there was no need, and I believed him because he was my grandson, and because I was still grieving Harold, and because I was tired of making decisions alone. She paused, pressing her palm flat against the counter to steady the tremor in her hand. But this, she said, pulling out another document I did not sign. It was a second transfer, dated 6 months ago. This one moved the property from Gavin Ashford to an entity called Ridgeline Property Holdings, LLC. The sale price listed was $425,000. The document carried a notarized signature that read Eleanor Ashford, but the handwriting, even to an untrained eye, carried subtle differences from the signature on the first transfer. He sold my house, Eleanor said. The words came out flat and precise, stripped of emotion by deliberate effort. He created a shell company. He forged my signature on the sale documents, and he deposited the proceeds into an account I have never seen at a bank in another county. Stone picked up the forged signature document and held it beside the genuine one. Even without forensic training, the differences were visible. The slant of the capital E, the spacing between the L and the E, the pressure of the pen heavier in the forgery, as if the hand that wrote it was working from memory rather than muscle. You caught all of this, Stone said. Not a question. I was a forensic accountant for the last 12 years of my career, Eleanor replied. Fraud detection was not my primary role, but it was part of every audit I conducted. I have reviewed thousands of signatures in my lifetime. I know what mine looks like, and I know what it looks like when someone else writes it. She gathered the documents into a neat stack and squared the edges against the counter with a tap, the way she might have squared a quarterly report before presenting it to a boardroom. This is not just elder abuse, she said quietly. This is wire fraud, forgery, identity theft, and real estate fraud across county lines. He has not just been hurting me, he has been dismantling my entire existence on paper. The kitchen was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a motorcycle engine idling in the parking lot outside. Stone looked at the stack of documents, then at Eleanor, and for the second time since he had known her, he felt the uncomfortable recognition that this woman was operating on a level that most people in his world would never reach. Not through violence or intimidation or brute force, but through the precise, patient accumulation of truth. She had been building a case for 8 months, not with anger, not with desperation. With the cold, methodical rigor of a professional who understood that numbers did not lie, and that the most devastating weapon against a liar was a complete, inaccurate record of every lie he had ever told. "What do you need from us?" Stone asked. Eleanor looked at him steadily. "I need this kept safe. I need copies made and stored in separate locations. And I need time, because there is one more thing I have to do before this is ready." "What I need a witness," she said. "Someone outside the club. Someone the law cannot dismiss as biased or unreliable. Someone who has seen what he does with their own eyes." Stone thought of the security camera Crank had spotted. The house next door to Eleanor's on Cedar Lane. The marigolds in the bird bath and the lens angled toward the street. "Your neighbor," he said. Eleanor nodded. "Nora Pellingham, 74 years old. She has lived next door for 19 years. She has seen things. I know she has. But Gavin threatened her once, came to her door, and told her that if she ever called anyone about what happened in his house, he would make her life very uncomfortable. Nora is a widow. She lives alone. She was afraid. Was I called her?" Eleanor said. "3 days ago, on the last day Gavin locked me in, he left his phone on the kitchen counter while he went to the bathroom. I had 45 seconds. I dialed Nora's number from memory and told her 3 things. I told her I was in trouble. I told her I was building a case. And I told her that if she was willing to be brave, I would make sure she was never alone in this again." Stone waited. "She said yes," Eleanor finished. "She said she has security camera footage from the last 14 months. She said she has been saving it because she did not know what else to do with it. And she said she has been waiting for someone to ask." The words landed in the room like a key turning in a lock. Not loud, not dramatic. Just the quiet, decisive sound of a door opening that had been sealed shut for a very long time. Brash looked at Stone. Stone looked at Eleanor, and Eleanor looked at neither of them because she was already reaching for her apron, tying it around her waist, and moving toward the stove with the deliberate efficiency of a woman who had delivered her report and was now returning to the work that kept her hands steady and her mind clear. "I am going to make the stew," she said simply. "We can discuss the rest after dinner." And she did. Beef stew with bay leaves and thyme, cornbread in the cast iron skillet, coffee brewed strong enough to strip paint. And while the clubhouse ate in a silence that was heavy with purpose rather than tension, Eleanor Ashford sat at the counter with a fresh cup of coffee and a pen, adding entry number 54 to the spiral notebook in the flour canister. Date, injury description, location on body, name of perpetrator, circumstances, duration of confinement, method of restraint. 5 days locked in my own home, she wrote. Deadbolt engaged from exterior. Phone confiscated, car keys removed. Contact with the outside world denied except for 45-second phone call made from perpetrator's device while he was in the bathroom. She closed the notebook, sealed it in the bag, and returned it to the canister. Then she washed her hands, dried them on the towel, and went back to slicing onions for tomorrow's soup, because Eleanor Ashford understood something that most people learn too late. The world did not stop turning because you were in pain. And the work of survival was not a single dramatic act, but a series of small, ordinary motions repeated with enough discipline to outlast the person trying to destroy you. 2 days later, Nora Pellingham arrived at the Iron Wolves clubhouse at 11 in the morning, driving a pale blue sedan that looked like it had been washed that morning specifically for the occasion. She was a compact woman with short white hair, bifocals on a beaded chain around her neck, and the nervous energy of someone who had made a decision she could not unmake and was determined to see it through before her courage expired. She wore a cardigan not unlike Eleanor's blue instead of lavender, and she clutched a handbag against her chest, the way a person holds a flotation device in deep water. Eleanor met her at the door. The two women looked at each other for a moment without speaking, and in that silence was the entire history of their 19-year neighborly acquaintance. The borrowed cups of sugar, the waved greetings from adjacent driveways, the Christmas cookies exchanged across the fence, And beneath all of it, the shared unspoken knowledge that something terrible was happening inside the Ashford house, acknowledged by neither of them until now. They embraced briefly carefully because Eleanor's ribs were still tender and Nora's hands were shaking. Then Eleanor led her inside past the bar and the card tables and the row of leather vests hanging from hooks along the wall into the back office where Stone waited with a fresh pot of coffee and two chairs positioned side by side in front of the desk. Nora sat down, accepted a cup of coffee she did not drink, and placed a small external hard drive on the desk between them. 14 months, she said. Her voice was thin but steady, the voice of a woman who had rehearsed this moment the way Eleanor had rehearsed her first walk through the clubhouse door. My security camera runs 24 hours. It is motion activated. It saves everything to this drive, and I back it up to a second drive that I keep in my safety deposit box at the bank. She pushed the hard drive forward with one finger, as if it were something fragile or dangerous or both. I have footage of him dragging her across the driveway by her arm, footage of him shoving her against the garage wall, footage of him standing over her on the front steps while she sat on the ground holding her wrist. I have footage of him screaming at her in the yard at 2 in the morning. I have footage of him throwing her purse into the bushes and making her crawl to get it. Her voice cracked on the last sentence, and she pressed her lips together and stared at the desk until the trembling stopped. I should have called the police, she said quietly. I know that. I have known that for 14 months. But he came to my door. He stood on my porch and he looked at me and he said that if I made trouble for him, he would make sure I regretted it. And I am 74 years old, and I live alone, and I believed him. Eleanor placed her hand over Nora's on the desk. You are here now, she said. That is what matters. Stone sat behind the desk, hands folded, listening. He did not interrupt, did not prompt. He understood that this was not his moment. It belonged to the two women sitting across from him, one bruised and one frightened, both old and both alone, and both choosing in the face of everything that had been done to keep them silent to speak. Nora looked at Eleanor. He would have killed you eventually, she said. The words were not dramatic. They were factual, delivered with the certainty of someone who had watched the escalation from her window for over a year and could see the trajectory as clearly as a line on a graph trending toward a point from which there was no return. I know, Eleanor replied. That was when Stone spoke. We need to get this footage to someone who can use it legally, he said. Can you confirm the camera's location, the dates, and that the footage has not been altered? Nora nodded. The camera company keeps installation records. The metadata on every file includes date, time, and GPS coordinates. I have not touched any of it. I do not even know how to edit video. I can barely send an email. That is exactly what makes it admissible, Eleanor said. And for a moment, the accountant in her surfaced fully clinical and precise. Unaltered footage from a fixed residential camera with verifiable metadata and a chain of custody that begins and ends with a single homeowner who has no technical capability to manipulate the files. Any defense attorney who challenges this will have to argue that a 74-year-old woman with bifocals manufactured deepfake surveillance footage, and no jury in Colorado will believe that. Stone almost smiled. Almost. He made copies of the hard drive that afternoon, one stored in the clubhouse safe, one in Brash's lockbox at his apartment, one in a sealed envelope that Eleanor addressed to herself at a post office box she had opened 3 months ago, under her maiden name, a detail that surprised no one in the room because by that point, they had stopped being surprised by the depth of Eleanor Ashford's preparation. The days that followed carried a tension that settled into the walls of the clubhouse like humidity before a thunderstorm. Eleanor continued her routine, arrived at 1:45, cooked, cleaned, balanced the books. But the rhythm had changed. She moved faster now, with less hesitation, as if the act of spreading her evidence across that counter had released a pressure that had been building for months. Her bruises were still visible. Her ribs still ached when she reached for high shelves. But her eyes were different, sharper, focused. The eyes of a woman who had moved past surviving and into the harder, colder territory of finishing what she had started. And then on a Friday just after 5 o'clock, the clubhouse door slammed open hard enough to crack the frame. Gavin Ashford stood in the entrance, red-faced and reeking of whiskey, his polo shirt wrinkled, his expensive sneakers scuffed, his eyes bright with the unstable fury of a man who had lost control of something he believed belonged to him and had come to take it back by force. The room reacted the way rooms full of dangerous men react to unexpected aggression. Conversation stopped. Bodies shifted. Hands moved to belts and table edges and the backs of chairs. Not reaching for weapons, but establishing proximity to them, the instinctive geometry of men who had spent their lives calculating threat and distance. "Where is she?" Gavin barked, scanning the room with the wild, unfocused gaze of someone who expected his volume to compensate for his lack of authority. Crank stood slowly, his chair scraping back across the concrete. Brash did not move at all, which was more threatening than any gesture. And Stone rose from his seat near the back wall, with the unhurried calm of a man who had been expecting this visit and had already decided exactly how it would end. "You must be," Gavin Stone said. Gavin's gaze snapped toward him, narrowing as he took in the shaved head, the leather vest, the folded arms, the absolute stillness. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face. Not fear, not yet, but the instinctive recalculation of a predator who had entered a room and discovered he was not at the top of the food chain. "You think this is funny?" he spat, recovering quickly. "My grandmother has no business being in a dump like this. She is confused. She is old. She does not know what she is doing. She is finishing her shift," Stone replied. "She will leave when she is ready." Gavin laughed, a harsh, brittle sound that bounced off the concrete walls and died without an echo. "She does not get to decide that." The room shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. Leather vest straightened, boots planted flat on the floor, shoulders squared, the subtle coordinated adjustment of men who had communicated without a word and arrived at the same conclusion simultaneously. "Actually," Stone said quietly, "she does." Gavin's jaw tightened. He took a step forward, then stopped, because Crank had moved into his peripheral vision on the left and Brash had materialized on the right, and the geometry of the room had changed in a way that left him exactly one path, the one that led back through the door he had entered. "You bikers think you are some kind of heroes," Gavin sneered, his voice rising to compensate for the ground he was losing. "She is a confused old woman. She signs whatever I put in front of her because she trusts me." "We know," Brash muttered, low enough to carry weight, loud enough to land. Gavin's head snapped toward him. "What is that supposed to mean?" And that was when the kitchen door opened and Eleanor stepped into view. She was smaller than every other person in that room. Her bruised face caught the overhead light and displayed the damage in full, the purple spreading across her cheekbone, the swollen eye, the fading marks on her collarbone visible above the neckline of her dress. She stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the main hall, dish towel still in her hand, apron tied at her waist, and she looked at the grandson she had raised from the age of 6 with an expression that contained no anger, no hatred, no pleading, just recognition. The final, irreversible recognition of a woman seeing clearly the person who stood before her and accepting at last that the boy she had loved was not the man she was looking at. Gavin pointed at her. "We are leaving. Now." Eleanor did not move. The silence stretched. Gavin's arm stayed extended, finger pointed, the gesture of a man accustomed to obedience who could not comprehend its absence. His face reddened further. His jaw worked, and in his eyes, beneath the whiskey and the rage and the entitlement that had carried him through 32 years of taking what was not his, something shifted. Something that looked for the first time like uncertainty. "I said we are leaving," he repeated, louder. Eleanor set the dish towel on the counter beside her. She straightened her glasses. She folded her hands in front of her apron. And she spoke with a voice that was quiet and clear and carried the weight of every silent meal, every locked door, every bruise she had cataloged in a spiral notebook hidden inside a flour canister. "I am not going anywhere with you," she said. 6 words, ordinary words, the kind spoken 1,000 times a day in 1,000 ordinary rooms. But these 6 words spoken by a 78-year-old woman with a bruised face and a swollen eye standing in a biker clubhouse kitchen with flour on her apron and a dish towel folded beside her carried the weight of 3 years of silence and 8 months of planning, and every locked door and confiscated phone and meal cooked in fear and bruise, documented in a notebook hidden inside a canister of flour. The words did not echo. They did not need to. They filled the room the way sunlight fills a space when curtains are finally opened completely and without apology. Gavin stared at her, his mouth opened then closed, His pointed finger slowly dropped to his side. And for a long, terrible moment, the only sound in the clubhouse was the tick of the clock behind the bar and the distant rumble of a truck passing on the highway. Then his face twisted. The uncertainty collapsed into rage, and the rage compressed into something small and vicious and familiar. "You will regret this," he said, his voice low and shaking. "You have no idea what I can do." Stone stepped forward. One step. Just enough to remind everyone in the room, including Gavin, that the distance between where Gavin stood and where Eleanor stood was occupied by men who did not flinch. "You should leave," Stone said, and his voice was not threatening. It was informational. The way a man might tell another man that the bridge ahead was out and the only option was to turn around. Gavin looked at Stone, looked at Brash, looked at Crank, looked at the row of silent, watching faces that lined the room like a wall he could not climb. And then he looked at Eleanor one more time, and what he saw there, the absence of the fear he had relied on for 3 years, seemed to break something inside him that he did not know how to repair. He turned and walked out. The door slammed behind him hard enough to rattle the windows for the second time that evening. The sound of his engine starting in the parking lot was followed by the screech of tires on gravel, a spray of rocks against the building's steel siding, and then silence. The kind of silence that follows the withdrawal of a threat, not peaceful, but watchful, the held breath of a room that knows the danger has left but has not ended. Eleanor stood in the kitchen doorway for another 10 seconds. Then her shoulders dropped, her hands unfolded, and she reached for the counter to steady herself because courage had a weight and she had been carrying all of hers at once. Crank brought her a chair. She sat down slowly, pressing one hand against her ribs. Stone poured a glass of water and set it in front of her. Brash stood near the door watching the parking lot through the window to make sure Gavin's headlights did not reappear. "He will escalate," Eleanor said after a moment. Her voice was tired but not defeated. "He has never been told no. Not by me, not by anyone. He will not accept it." Stone nodded. "We know." Eleanor looked up at him. "I want to file a statement. Tonight. A full statement. Everything. The abuse, the fraud, the forgery, the house. All of it. I want it on record before he has time to destroy anything else." Stone studied her face. The bruise, the swollen eye, the set of her jaw. "Are you sure?" She did not hesitate. "I have been sure for 8 months. I was just waiting until I had enough evidence to make it impossible for anyone to look the other way. And now I do." Stone pulled out his phone. He dialed a number, waited, and spoke briefly. "Stratton, it is Stone. I need you at the clubhouse tonight. And bring the intake forms." He hung up and dialed again. "Detective Hollis, this is Stone Mercer from the Iron Wolves. I have a woman here with a bruised face, a box of forged documents, 14 months of surveillance footage, and a grandson who just showed up drunk and threatening. She wants to give a formal statement tonight. Can you come?" He listened, nodded, closed the phone. "They are both on their way," he said. Eleanor exhaled, not with relief, but with the quiet, steady release of someone who had been holding a door shut for a very long time and had finally heard the lock click into place from the other side. She asked for paper and a pen. Stone gave her a legal pad and a ballpoint from the desk drawer. She sat at the counter and began to write, and she wrote for 3 hours without stopping, filling page after page with the same small, precise handwriting that had balanced corporate ledgers and tracked stolen money and documented every bruise her grandson had ever given her. She wrote about the day Harold died and the silence that followed. She wrote about Gavin moving in and the kindness that came first and the cruelty that replaced it so gradually. She did not recognize the transition until she was already inside it. She wrote about the first time he grabbed her wrist and the excuse she made, and the second time he grabbed her harder and the excuse she made for that too. She wrote about the documents she signed and the ones she did not sign, and the money that vanished and the house that disappeared from beneath her feet while she was still living in it. She wrote about the 5 days locked inside, the deadbolt, the confiscated phone, the silence of a house that had become a prison. And she wrote about the 45-second phone call to Nora Pellingham and the moment she decided that the fear of what Gavin might do was finally smaller than the fear of what would happen if she let him continue. When she finished, she set the pen down, squared the pages against the counter, and placed them in a neat stack beside her empty coffee cup. I raised him from the time he was 6 years old, she said, to no one in particular and to everyone at once. I taught him to read, helped him with his homework, drove him to baseball practice every Saturday for 9 years. I loved him the way you love a child who has lost everything and needs someone to tell him the world is still safe. She looked at her hands. The bruises on her wrist had faded to yellow. The ones on her face had not. But love is not a contract, she said quietly, and it is not a debt. I do not owe him my house. I do not owe him my money, and I do not owe him my silence, not anymore. Crank, who had been standing near the kitchen door for the last hour, turned away and wiped his face with the back of his hand. Brash leaned against the wall with his eyes closed, and Stone sat across the counter from Eleanor Ashford and recognized with a certainty that settled deep into his bones that he was witnessing something that most people never got to see. Not the collapse of a victim, not the rescue of someone helpless, but the deliberate, exhausted, magnificent act of a woman who had spent 78 years building a life, watched it get stolen piece by piece by someone she loved, and then sat down at a counter in a biker clubhouse with a legal pad and a ballpoint pen and took it back. Stratton Birch arrived at 8. Detective Hollis arrived at 8:15. Eleanor gave her statement, signed it, dated it, handed over copies of every document, provided the hard drive, provided the notebook. And when it was done, when the lawyer and the detective had left and the clubhouse was quiet and the clock behind the bar read 11:47, Eleanor untied her apron, folded it neatly, and hung it on the hook beside the stove. Stone walked her to the stairs that led to the upstairs room. Crank had spent the afternoon fixing the loose railing, replacing the lock, and setting up a cot with clean sheets and a wool blanket. Darla had left a towel and a bar of soap on the nightstand beside a glass of water. It was not much. Bare walls painted a faded industrial white, a single window that looked out over the gravel lot and the grain elevator beyond, a floor that creaked with every step, the faint smell of old cardboard from whatever had been stored there before. But the door locked from the inside and the key was hers, and no one could open it without her permission. And that, for Eleanor Ashford, was worth more than any mansion on Cedar Lane had ever been worth. Because a house without a lock you control is not a home. It is a container, and she had spent long enough being contained. She paused at the top of the stairs, looked down at Stone, who stood at the bottom with one hand resting on the railing. Crank had fixed his broad silhouette backlit by the single bulb in the hallway below. "Thank you," she said. He shook his head. "You did this. All of it. We just held the door open." She considered that for a moment. Then she nodded, stepped into the room, and closed the door behind her. The lock turned with a soft, definitive click. Stone stood at the bottom of the stairs for a long time, listening to the silence above, and then he went back to the bar and poured himself a whiskey and sat alone in the empty clubhouse while the clock ticked past midnight and the parking lot outside lay still under a sky full of Colorado stars. He thought about a woman who had walked through his door with a bruised arm asking for work, and who had turned out to be the most dangerous person he had ever met. Not because she could hurt anyone, but because she could prove everything. The warrant was issued on a Monday morning, and by Monday afternoon, Gavin Ashford had vanished. Detective Hollis called Stone at 12:17 with the update, her voice clipped with professional frustration. Officers had arrived at the Cedar Lane house at 9:45 with an arrest warrant for assault, fraud, forgery, identity theft, and real estate fraud across county lines. The front door was unlocked. The house was empty. Gavin's SUV was gone. His closet had been cleared of essentials. A dresser drawer in the master bedroom had been left open, emptied in haste, with a sock and a crumpled receipt on the carpet beneath it. His phone, the one he had used to monitor Eleanor, to track her mileage, to time her errands, to control the borders of her existence, was sitting on the kitchen counter with the battery removed. He knew, Hollis said. Someone tipped him, or he figured it out on his own after the confrontation at the clubhouse. Either way, he had at least 48 hours head start. Stone relayed the information to Eleanor, who was sitting at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee and the morning's receipts spread before her in neat rows. She listened without interrupting, set her coffee down, and was quiet for a long moment. "He will not run far," she said finally. "Gavin has never been resourceful. He has been lucky. Those are different things. Lucky people do not know how to survive when the luck runs out." Stone studied her face. The bruises had faded to a dull yellow-green, and the swelling around her eye had receded enough that both eyes were fully open for the first time in weeks. She looked tired but composed the way a general looks after the orders have been given, and the only thing left is to wait for the field reports. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Eleanor picked up her coffee again. "I am thinking that a man who has spent 3 years controlling a 78-year-old woman is not the kind of man who disappears quietly. He will do something, file something, claim something. Because taking is the only skill he has. And when you take that away from him, he has nothing left but the instinct to take one more thing." She was right. It took 4 days. On Friday morning, Stratton Birch called Stone from his office downtown with a voice that carried the particular tension of a lawyer delivering news he wished he did not have. "Gavin has filed a petition," Birch had said. "Emergency conservatorship. He is claiming Eleanor is mentally incompetent and that she has been unduly influenced by a criminal organization to fabricate allegations against her legal caretaker. He has an attorney, a real one. Name is Prescott Langley out of Colorado Springs, and he has a medical affidavit." Stone felt the temperature in his chest drop several degrees. A medical affidavit from who? A doctor named Fenton, general practitioner. Gavin apparently took Eleanor to see him twice last year for routine checkups. Fenton signed a statement suggesting Eleanor exhibited signs of cognitive decline consistent with early-stage dementia. Confusion, memory lapses, difficulty managing personal affairs. Stone was quiet for a moment. "Is any of that true?" Birch paused. "It does not matter if it is true. It matters if a judge believes it. And Langley is good. He specializes in estate disputes and conservatorship cases. He knows how to make a 78-year-old woman sound fragile in front of a bench." Stone hung up and walked to the kitchen where Eleanor was rolling out pie crust with the methodical precision of a woman who used baking the way other people use meditation. He told her everything: the petition, the attorney, the medical affidavit, the claim of incompetence. Eleanor's rolling pin stopped mid-stroke. She stood motionless for 5 seconds, hands flat on the dough flour dusting her forearms, and in those 5 seconds, Stone watched something move across her face that he had not seen before. Not fear, not anger, something older and colder. The expression of a woman who had spent 8 months building a fortress of evidence and had just learned that her enemy was trying to burn it down, not by attacking the evidence, but by attacking the person who gathered it. "If the conservatorship is granted," she said slowly, "then everything I have done becomes worthless. Every document, every photograph, every page in that notebook. If a judge rules that I am not competent to manage my own affairs, then my testimony is inadmissible. My financial analysis is the work of a confused old woman. My statement to Detective Hollis is the ramblings of someone who cannot distinguish reality from delusion." And Gavin walks free. She wiped the flour from her hands with deliberate care, as if the act of cleaning each finger individually was the only thing keeping the rest of her from shaking. "He is not trying to win," she said. "He is trying to erase me. Erase my mind. Erase my credibility. Erase the idea that a 78-year-old woman could possibly understand what was being done to her, let alone prove it. Because if he can convince a judge that I am incompetent, then everything I built over 8 months dissolves. Not because it is wrong, not because it is inaccurate, but because the person who built it has been legally declared incapable of building anything." She pressed her palms flat on the counter, steadying herself. "He knows he cannot beat the evidence," she said quietly. "So he is trying to destroy the witness. And the weapon he chose is the one this world hands to men like him every single day. The assumption that old means broken." Stone watched the controlled fury move across her face and said nothing, because what he was witnessing was not a woman falling apart. It was a woman recalibrating, adjusting, redirecting the same patient forensic discipline that had carried her through 8 months of documentation toward a new target. And the target was a courtroom. The hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday at the Riverton County Courthouse, a squat brick building on Main Street with a flagpole out front and a parking lot that smelled of diesel from the bus depot next door. Stratton Birch filed a response brief opposing the conservatorship petition, citing Eleanor's documented professional history, her current volunteer work managing the financial records of a local organization, and the absence of any prior medical diagnosis of cognitive impairment from her regular physician, who was not the doctor Gavin had selected for the affidavit. But Birch was honest with Stone in private. "This is going to come down to the hearing," he said. "Langley will put Eleanor on the stand, and he will try to make her look confused, forgetful, and manipulated. If she stumbles, if she hesitates, if she contradicts herself, even once, Langley will use it to argue that the entire case against Gavin is the product of a deteriorating mind being exploited by dangerous men." He gestured vaguely toward the clubhouse. No offense, Stone relayed this to Eleanor that evening. She was sitting in the upstairs room at the small table Crank had placed near the window, the evening light casting long shadows across the pages spread before her. She had been reviewing her own documents for hours, cross-referencing entries, checking dates, verifying figures, preparing for the hearing, with the same rigor she had once applied to corporate audits. She listened to Stone's summary without expression. Then she removed her glasses, cleaned them on the hem of her cardigan, replaced them, and spoke with a clarity that left no room for doubt. "Stratton will handle the legal arguments," she said, "but I will handle the stand. I have been waiting for this. Not the hearing specifically, but the moment when someone in authority sits across from me and I get to show them exactly what I know, exactly how I know it, and exactly how long I have known it." She tapped the stack of documents on the table. "Gavin's entire defense rests on the assumption that I am old and therefore confused, that I am female and therefore easily manipulated, that I am a grandmother and therefore too sentimental to think clearly. He has built his case on the same assumptions he has used to control me for 3 years. And I am going to dismantle those assumptions the same way I have dismantled every fraudulent balance sheet I have ever encountered, line by line, number by number, until there is nothing left but the truth." Stone looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded and left the room without another word because there was nothing to add, and he knew it. Thursday arrived under a gray Colorado sky, clouds stacked low over the mountains to the west, like a ceiling being slowly lowered. The courthouse parking lot was half full by 8:30. Stratton Birch arrived in a press suit with a briefcase that looked heavier than it had the week before. Detective Hollis sat in the second row of the gallery, in plain clothes, her badge visible on her belt, a deliberate choice that signaled to the court that law enforcement had an active interest in the proceedings. Eleanor wore a navy blue dress she had purchased from a second-hand shop in town the day before, chosen not for appearance, but for professionalism. No lavender cardigan, no floral print, no orthopedic shoes that invited the eye to see frailty before it saw the person wearing them. She wore low heels that clicked on the courthouse tile with a rhythm that sounded less like walking and more like counting. Her hair was pinned tighter than usual, secured with 2 clips instead of 1. Her glasses were polished. Her hands were steady. She carried a single manila folder. Gavin was already seated at the petitioner's table when she entered, flanked by Prescott and Langley, a tall man in his late 50s with silver temples and the practiced composure of someone who had argued cases like this many times before and won most of them. Gavin wore a sport coat and a tie, which Eleanor had never seen him wear in 32 years of knowing him. His hair was combed, his face was clean-shaven. He looked to anyone unfamiliar with the situation like a concerned young man worried about his elderly grandmother's welfare. He did not look at Eleanor as she took her seat at the respondent's table beside Birch. She did not look at him either, though for different reasons. Gavin avoided her eyes because guilt, however deeply buried, has its own gravity. Eleanor avoided his because she had moved past the point where his presence affected her strategy, and wasting attention on him now would be like an accountant staring at the person who falsified the numbers instead of the numbers themselves. The Honorable Judge Ruth Calloway presided. She was a woman in her 60s with reading glasses perched on her nose and an expression that suggested she had heard every version of every story the human species was capable of producing and was no longer impressed by any of them. She reviewed the petition, the response, and the supporting documents in silence for several minutes while the courtroom waited. Langley presented first. His argument was measured, sympathetic, and surgically constructed. He described Eleanor as a beloved grandmother who had suffered the loss of her husband and had in her grief and isolation fallen under the influence of individuals associated with a motorcycle club known for criminal activity. He painted a picture of vulnerability with the skill of a man who understood that courtrooms were theaters and judges were audiences who responded to narrative before they responded to law. He referenced the medical affidavit from Dr. Fenton, citing observations of confusion and memory difficulty during 2 office visits. He described Gavin as a devoted grandson who had sacrificed his own career to care for Eleanor and manage her affairs, and who had become alarmed when she began spending time at a location he characterized as dangerous and exploitative. He never raised his voice, never employed dramatic pauses, never appealed to emotion explicitly, which was itself the most emotional technique available to a skilled litigator, because restraint in a courtroom implies confidence, and confidence implies truth. He spoke for 22 minutes, and by the time he sat down, the picture he had painted was vivid enough that several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, including two of the Iron Wolves members in the back row, who recognized the power of a well-told lie precisely because they had spent their lives surrounded by men who told them. Birch responded with the legal framework. He cited the statutory requirements for conservatorship in Colorado, the burden of proof on the petitioner, the absence of a formal cognitive evaluation, and the questionable independence of a physician selected and compensated by the person seeking conservatorship. He was competent and thorough, but his argument was defensive by nature, and everyone in the room could feel the weight of Langley's narrative pressing against the walls. Then Birch called Eleanor to the stand. She rose from her chair, walked to the witness box, sat down, adjusted her glasses, placed the manila folder on the rail in front of her, and looked at Judge Calloway with the same expression she had worn the first day she walked into the Iron Wolves clubhouse. Straight spine, chin lifted, eyes tired, but absolutely unmistakably steady. Birch began with simple questions designed to establish her background: her name, her age, her address, her professional history. Eleanor answered each one with the economy of a woman who understood that courtrooms, like balance sheets, rewarded precision and punished waste. Then Birch asked the question that opened the door. Mrs. Stushaunamasis Ashford, can you describe your professional experience with financial record keeping? Eleanor turned slightly to face the judge rather than the attorney, a subtle but deliberate choice that placed her testimony in direct conversation with the person who held her future. I began my career as a junior bookkeeper at Carver Langston Manufacturing in Denver in 1969, she said. Over the course of 35 years, I advanced to senior accountant and was responsible for managing the quarterly financial reporting for a company with annual revenues exceeding $40 million. During the final 12 years of my career, my role included forensic audit functions, which involved the identification and documentation of financial irregularities, including fraud, embezzlement, and misrepresentation of assets. She spoke without notes, without hesitation, without a single verbal pause or uncertainty. Her voice was clear, her diction precise, and her cadence steady, the voice of a woman who had delivered hundreds of presentations in boardrooms and conference calls, and who understood that confidence was not volume but consistency. Langley shifted in his seat. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, but Stone, seated in the back of the gallery, noticed it. Birch then asked Eleanor to describe the financial activity she had identified in her grandson's management of her accounts. And that was when the courtroom changed. Eleanor opened the manila folder. Inside were 6 pages, hand-prepared, each one a summary of a different financial instrument: the savings account, the pension, the checking account, the mortgage, the title transfer, the shell company. Each page contained columns of dates, amounts, account numbers, and notations organized with the same meticulous structure that had balanced corporate ledgers for 3.5 decades. She began with the savings account. On March 14th of the year following my husband's death, she said a withdrawal of $15,000 was made from our joint savings account at First National Bank. The withdrawal slip carries my signature, but I was at a medical appointment at the Riverton Orthopedic Clinic at the time of the transaction. I have the appointment confirmation and the clinic's sign-in log to verify my location. She turned to the next entry. On April 9th, a second withdrawal of $22,000. On May 3rd, $8,000. On June 20th, $40,000, transferred to an account at Western Range Credit Union that I have never held and whose existence I was unaware of until I retrieved the statements from Gavin's desk drawer while he was at work. She moved through the entries without pausing, without referring to notes, without losing her place. Date after date, amount after amount, each one recited from memory with the fluency of someone who had lived with these numbers for 8 months and had committed them to memory not through effort, but through the accumulated weight of betrayal. The courtroom was silent. Langley had stopped writing. Gavin stared at the table in front of him. And Judge Calloway leaned forward slightly in her chair, her reading glasses sliding down her nose, watching Eleanor Ashford with the focused attention of a woman who recognized competence when she saw it. Eleanor reached the title transfer. On October 7th, she said the property at 14 Cedar Lane, which my husband and I purchased in 1983 and paid off in full in 1998, was transferred from my name to my grandson's name for a stated consideration of $1. I signed this document. I was told it was for estate planning purposes. I did not consult an attorney because my grandson assured me it was unnecessary. She paused. One beat, two. However, she continued on April 12th of the following year. That same property was sold by my grandson to an entity called Ridgeline Property Holdings, LLC, for $425,000. Ridgeline Property Holdings was incorporated 3 weeks before the sale lists a registered agent at a mailbox service in Grand Junction, and has no other assets, employees, or business activity. The incorporator is listed as G. Ashford. She turned to face the judge directly. The sale document carries my signature as co-grantor, she said, but I did not sign it. I was not aware of the sale. The signature is a forgery, and I can demonstrate this because the capital E in my name on that document carries a clockwise loop at the base, which is a habit of the forger's hand and not of mine. In 35 years of signing financial documents, I have never once produced a clockwise loop on a capital E. My E begins with a downward stroke. Always. She placed both documents side by side on the rail and angled them toward the judge. The total financial loss across all accounts and the property sale, she said, is $766,812, $341,000 in liquid assets, $425,000 in real estate. Every dollar documented, every transaction dated, every forgery identifiable. She closed the folder and placed her hands flat on the rail. I am 78 years old, she said, and her voice did not waver. I wear orthopedic shoes and a lavender cardigan, and I bake apple pies on Friday afternoons. I understand why that makes it easy to assume I am confused, but I balanced $40 million ledgers for 35 years. I identified fraud in quarterly audits that professional investigators had missed, and I spent the last 8 months documenting every crime my grandson committed against me with the same precision I applied to every audit I ever conducted. She looked at Langley, then at Gavin, then back at the judge. I am not confused, she said. I am not manipulated, and I am not incompetent. I am a retired forensic accountant who has been beaten, robbed, and locked inside her own home by a man she raised from childhood. And I have the receipts. The courtroom held its breath. In the gallery, Stone sat with his arms folded across his chest, motionless, watching the judge's face for the same tells he watched for in men across poker tables and negotiation rooms. Beside him, Crank sat with his hands on his knees, fingers white with pressure, his jaw so tight a muscle jumped visibly at his temple. Behind them, 3 other Iron Wolves members occupied seats along the back wall, not because they had been asked, but because they had shown up that morning in pressed shirts with their vests left at the clubhouse, understanding without being told that this courtroom was Eleanor's battlefield, and their role was to be present without drawing fire. Detective Hollis sat 2 rows forward, her pen still poised above her notepad, though she had stopped writing 5 minutes ago, because what Eleanor was doing on that stand did not require documentation. It required witness. And at the petitioner's table, Gavin Ashford sat with his hands clasped in front of him, staring at the wood grain of the table as if it contained an escape route. The sport coat that had looked professional an hour ago now hung on his shoulders like something borrowed the posture beneath it, shrinking by degrees as each of Eleanor's numbers landed in the courtroom record, like nails driven into a case he could not close. Judge Calloway removed her reading glasses. She studied Eleanor for a long, measured moment. Then she looked at Langley. "Counselor," she said, "does your client wish to cross-examine Langley?" Looked at Gavin. Gavin's face had gone pale beneath the courtroom fluorescence, the sport coat and tie now looking less like concern and more like a costume that no longer fit. He shook his head once, a tight, involuntary movement. Langley stood. "We have no questions at this time, Your Honor." Calloway nodded. She reviewed the documents Eleanor had submitted. She reviewed Dr. Fenton's affidavit. She read Birch's response brief. And then she spoke. "The petition for emergency conservatorship is denied," she said. The court finds no credible evidence of cognitive impairment sufficient to warrant the appointment of a conservator. The respondent has demonstrated clear, detailed, and independently verifiable knowledge of her financial affairs, her personal circumstances, and the alleged conduct of the petitioner. Dr. Fenton's affidavit is noted but given limited weight as it is based on 2 routine office visits and does not constitute a comprehensive cognitive evaluation. She looked at Gavin. The court further notes that the petitioner has an active arrest warrant in this jurisdiction and recommends that counsel advise his client accordingly. The gavel came down, and in that moment before the courtroom stirred, before Langley gathered his papers, before Gavin could process what had happened, Stratton Birch stood and addressed the bench. "Your Honor, if I may, we have one additional matter." Calloway raised an eyebrow. "Proceed." Birch opened his briefcase and removed a file. During the course of investigating the financial crimes alleged by Mrs. Ashford, he said, our team identified a pattern of similar activity linked to the petitioner in a neighboring county. Specifically, a gentleman named Howard Embry, aged 81, residing in the town of Millhaven. Mr. Embry was a widower with no surviving children. Between 2 and 3 years ago, Gavin Ashford befriended Mr. Embry through a church volunteer program. Over the following 18 months, Mr. Ashford gained power of attorney, redirected Mr. Embry's pension and Social Security benefits, transferred ownership of his home, and liquidated approximately $230,000 in savings and investments. Birch paused. "Mr. Embry passed away 11 months ago," he continued, "alone, in a house that no longer belonged to him. His death was attributed to natural causes, but no investigation was conducted into the financial irregularities because there was no one left to report them. No children, no spouse, no neighbor who thought to ask why the lawn had stopped being mowed or why the mailbox stayed full for a week before someone finally noticed." Birch paused, and in that pause, the courtroom understood what Eleanor had understood the moment she heard the name Howard Embry, that she was not a special case. She was a template, a method refined through repetition. Find someone old, find someone alone, find someone grieving, become indispensable, become trusted, become the person who handles everything, and then handle everything into your own pocket, one signature at a time, until there is nothing left to take and no one left to tell. The courtroom had gone still in a way that was different from silence. It was the stillness of people absorbing something that restructured their understanding of what they were witnessing. This was not a family dispute. This was not a grandson who had made mistakes under financial pressure. This was a pattern, practiced, refined, repeated. Gavin sat motionless at the petitioner's table. His face had gone from pale to gray. Langley leaned over and whispered something in his ear, but Gavin did not respond. He stared at the table in front of him as if the surface held instructions for a situation he had never imagined. Birch placed the file on the bench. "We have submitted these findings to the district attorney's office," he said, "and we believe they are relevant to the court's assessment of the petitioner's character and intent in this matter." Calloway reviewed the file. Her expression did not change, but her jaw tightened in a way that suggested the temperature behind her composure had dropped considerably. "The court has noted the submission," she said. "Counsel for the petitioner is advised that additional charges may be forthcoming." She looked directly at Gavin. "Mr. Ashford, I strongly recommend you do not leave this jurisdiction." That was when the courtroom doors opened and Detective Hollis walked forward from the gallery, badge visible, followed by a uniformed officer. "Gavin Ashford," Hollis said, "you are under arrest on charges of assault, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, forgery, wire fraud, and identity theft. Additional charges related to a second victim may be filed pending further investigation." Gavin turned in his chair. His eyes found Eleanor across the aisle for the first time since the hearing began. And the expression on his face was not defiance, not anger, not even fear. It was the blank, disoriented confusion of a man who had built his entire life on the certainty that no one would ever hold him accountable, and who was only now discovering that certainty had an expiration date. "You did this," he said. His voice cracked on the last word. Eleanor looked at her grandson, the boy she had raised from 6 years old. The child who had eaten cereal at her kitchen table and chased fireflies in her backyard and fallen asleep on her couch during Saturday movies. The young man who had carried her groceries and mowed her lawn and called him Grandma Ellie until the day he decided she was more useful as a bank account than as a person. "No," she said. Her voice was quiet but carried through the courtroom with the precision of a statement she had been composing for longer than anyone knew. "You did." The officer stepped forward. The handcuffs clicked shut with a sound that was smaller than anyone expected, a metallic whisper that carried none of the drama of the moment it represented. Gavin was led from the courtroom without further incident, though his steps faltered twice on the way to the door, as if his legs had not yet received the message that the ground beneath his life had permanently shifted. Langley followed at a distance, speaking rapidly into his phone, in a tone that suggested his client's financial resources for legal defense had suddenly become a more complicated question than anticipated. The courtroom doors closed behind them. The sound of footsteps faded down the hallway, and the room settled into the particular stillness that follows the removal of a threat, not relief exactly, but the slow, cautious exhalation of people who had been holding themselves rigid and were only now discovering how tightly they had been clenched. Eleanor remained seated at the respondent's table. She did not move. She did not stand. She did not turn to look at the gallery or the judge or the empty chair where Gavin had been sitting. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, the manila folder closed on the rail before her eyes fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance that only she could see. And if anyone had been watching closely enough, they would have noticed that her hands, those steady, precise accountant's hands that had delivered every number without a tremor, were shaking now. Not with fear, not with relief, but with the delayed tremor of a body releasing adrenaline it had been burning for 8 months. Birch packed his briefcase and placed a hand briefly on her shoulder. Stone waited in the gallery. Detective Hollis returned to confirm that the arrest had been processed and that the district attorney would be in touch regarding the Embry case. When the room was nearly empty, Eleanor stood. She walked out of the courthouse into the pale midday light where the clouds had broken just enough to let a single column of sun fall across the parking lot like a spotlight on an empty stage. Stone fell into step beside her. They walked to his truck without speaking. At the passenger door, she stopped. "Howard Embry," she said quietly. "I did not know about him." "Not until Stratton told me yesterday." Stone opened the door for her. "I know." She looked at the courthouse behind them. "He died alone," she said, "in a house someone stole from him, and no one noticed. No one asked. No one came." She turned to Stone, and for the first time since he had known her, Eleanor Ashford let the full weight of what she carried show on her face. Not the bruises which had faded, not the fatigue which had become permanent, but the grief. The particular unresolvable grief of a woman who had survived something that another person had not, and who understood that the difference between them was not strength or intelligence, but the blind, arbitrary luck of having walked into the right building on the right afternoon and found people willing to stand behind her. "If I had not come to you," she said, "I would be Howard Embry." Stone did not argue, did not reassure, did not offer the comfortable lie that things would have worked out eventually. He simply nodded because he knew she was right, and respecting her meant not pretending otherwise. They drove back to the clubhouse in silence. The weeks that followed moved with the deliberate pace of a legal system working through the machinery of accountability. The district attorney filed formal charges. The house transfer was challenged in court under undue influence statutes and voided. A temporary protective order barred Gavin from coming within 500 feet of Eleanor. His accounts were frozen pending investigation. The Ridgeline Property Holdings Shell Company was dissolved and the sale proceeds were placed in escrow pending recovery. The house on Cedar Lane was returned to Eleanor's name. She went back once, on a Saturday morning with Stone driving and Crank riding behind them on his bike, because he had not been asked but had shown up anyway and no one suggested he shouldn't. Eleanor stood in the driveway of the Colonial with the white shutters and looked at it the way a person looks at a photograph of someone they used to be. With recognition, but not belonging. With tenderness, but not longing. She walked through every room. The kitchen, where she had cooked 10,000 meals and taught Gavin how to crack an egg when he was 8 and burned the first batch of cookies he ever made and laughed about it until he laughed too. The living room where Harold's chair had been pushed to the corner and where the marks on the carpet still showed where it had stood for decades before someone decided it was in the way. The bedroom where she had slept beside her husband for 41 years and then alone for 3 and then not at all because the locks had been changed and the space had stopped being hers long before the deed confirmed it. She stood longest in the hallway where the family photographs had been removed from the walls. The hooks were still there. Small holes in the plaster where nails had held frames that contained the only visual record of a family that had once been whole. Junie's kindergarten portrait, Harold and Eleanor's wedding photograph, Gavin at 6 sitting on Harold's lap in the backyard grinning at the camera with a gap where his front teeth should have been. All of them boxed and stored in the guest bedroom as if the Ashford family was an archive rather than a lineage, something to be filed away rather than displayed. She spent 40 minutes inside. When she came out, she locked the front door, put the key in her purse, and got back into the truck. "I am going to sell it," she said. Stone glanced at her. "It is a beautiful house," she continued. "Harold and I built a life there. But a house is walls and a roof and a number on a mailbox. It is not the life that happened inside it. And I will not live in a place where the memories have been poisoned by what came after." She paused, looking out the window as Cedar Lane receded behind them. "I am going to use the money to start a fund," she said, "for people like Howard Embry, people who are old and alone and being taken apart by someone they trusted, people who do not have a clubhouse to walk into, people whose doors do not lock from the inside." She was quiet for a moment. "I spent 35 years balancing other people's books," she said, "making sure the numbers added up and the money went where it was supposed to go. I think I have one more set of books left in me, and this time the numbers are going to add up to something that matters more than quarterly earnings." Stone drove. Crank followed. The road unwound behind them like a sentence that had finally found its period. The Iron Wolves did not make speeches about what they had done. They did not hang banners or hold ceremonies or pat themselves on the back for the role they had played in the unraveling of Gavin Ashford. That was not how men like them process things. They process things by doing. Crank repaired the upstairs room properly, replaced the cot with a real bed frame that he assembled himself, cursing quietly over the instructions for 2 hours before producing something sturdy and level. He sanded the floorboards and sealed them with polyurethane. He installed a proper light fixture to replace the bare bulb. Brash brought a bookshelf from a second-hand store and carried it up the stairs without comment. Darla hung curtains cream-colored with small blue flowers, chosen because they reminded her of something her own grandmother would have liked, though she would have denied this if asked. Stone placed a sturdy oak desk near the window because he had noticed that Eleanor always chose the spot with the most natural light when she worked, and he wanted her to have a place where the light reached her without obstruction. When Eleanor walked into the finished room 2 days later, she pressed her fingers to her mouth and stood very still. She looked at the desk near the window, where the afternoon light fell in a warm rectangle across the polished surface. She looked at the bookshelf against the wall and the curtains that moved gently in the draft from the cracked window and the bed frame that was level and sturdy and made by hands that had never asked for anything in return. She looked at the lock on the inside of the door, a simple deadbolt, the kind that cost $12 at a hardware store and was worth more to her than anything she had ever owned. She did not cry the way people cry in stories with dramatic bow and cathartic releases. She cried the way real people cry when something they did not believe they deserved is given to them without conditions. Quietly, briefly. With one hand covering her eyes and the other braced against the door frame, as if the ground beneath her had shifted and she needed a moment to find her balance. "Thank you," she said, and the words were insufficient, and she knew it, and they knew it, and no one tried to make them bigger than they were. That Sunday during dinner, Stone raised a glass. To Eleanor, he said, "Who walked in here asking for a job?" Crank grinned and ended up reorganizing our entire lives. Laughter moved through the room, warm and genuine and tinged with the particular affection that men who are not comfortable with sentiment express through volume and repetition. Eleanor stood slowly, a glass of iced tea trembling slightly in her hand. She looked around the room at the leather vests and the tattoos and the scarred hands and the faces that had frightened her not at all on the day she first walked through the door, because she had understood even then that the most dangerous people in the world are not the ones who look dangerous. They are the ones who look like your grandson. "I thought I was coming here to earn my keep," she said softly. "I did not realize I was walking into the only place strong enough to remind me I still had worth." Crank looked down at his plate. Brash cleared his throat, and Stone held his glass steady and nodded once the way he always did with the economy of a man who believed that the best things were said in the fewest words. Later that night, Eleanor sat outside on the clubhouse steps beneath a sky scattered with stars. The Colorado air was cool against her cheeks, carrying the scent of pine from the foothills to the west and the faint, permanent undertone of engine oil from the garage below. The parking lot was quiet. The motorcycles stood in their row chrome, catching starlight. The grain elevator rose dark against the sky like a sentinel from another century. Stone came out through the side door, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He handed her one without asking if she wanted it, because by now he knew that she always did, and sat down on the step beside her with the careful weight of a man who had learned that presence was more valuable than conversation. They sat in silence for a while. Inside, someone laughed. Someone argued about a card game. The jukebox played something low and slow that drifted through the walls like a memory trying to find its way home. "Regret it?" Stone asked finally. Eleanor considered the question the way she considered all questions, carefully and completely, giving it the respect of genuine thought rather than the convenience of an automatic answer. "I regret staying silent as long as I did," she said. "I regret the months I spent telling myself it was not that bad, that he would change, that I owed him patience because he had lost his mother and his grandfather and because I was all he had left. I regret every excuse I made on his behalf that cost me a piece of myself. I will not get back." She took a sip of coffee. "But I do not regret walking through that door," she said. "And I do not regret sitting in that courtroom and saying out loud what he did to me and what he did to Howard Embry and what he would have done to the next person after me if no one had stopped him." She looked at the stars. "And I do not regret the pies," she added. Stone almost smiled. Almost. They sat on the steps while the night deepened and the stars multiplied and the coffee cooled in their hands. Inside the clubhouse, the sounds of ordinary life continued. Arguments and laughter and the scrape of chairs and the clink of glasses and the low constant hum of a place where people existed alongside each other without pretense. It was not the life Eleanor Ashford had imagined at 78. She had imagined Harold beside her on a porch swing watching the garden grow. She had imagined Sunday dinners with family. She had imagined growing old in a house that held her history in every room. Instead, she was sitting on the concrete steps of a biker clubhouse in an industrial district, wearing an apron dusted with flour with the faint shadow where a bruise had been now nearly invisible against skin that was learning to heal. She had lost her house, her savings, her privacy, and the grandson she had raised like a son. She had gained a room above a garage, a desk near a window, and the knowledge that she had stood in a courtroom and spoken the truth with a precision that left no room for doubt. And sometimes she thought safety is the bravest dream of all. Eleanor Ashford had walked into a biker clubhouse with a bruised arm asking for work. What she found instead was something she had stopped believing existed. Not rescue, not charity, not the loud dramatic salvation that stories promised and life rarely delivered. She found a door that locked from the inside, and she found the courage to close it behind her and call it home.